Real estate investment practice problem using Excel. Lender credit calculation method number 1. Get ready because it's time to raise the stakes with real estate. Here we are in our Excel worksheet. If you have access to the Excel worksheet, would like to follow along, note that we have 3 tabs down below: example, practice, and a blank. Let's take a look at them now, starting with the example tab, in essence being an answer key, focusing in on the lender credit, in essence being the opposite of points, which we talked about in a prior presentation or in prior presentations, which is the concept of making a payment up front in order to pay down the interest rate so that you can get a lower monthly payment and possibly a benefit over the life of the loan. With the lender credit, you're doing in essence the opposite because you're looking for more cash flow up front in order to close things out and possibly thinking about a lender credit that can be applied towards the closing costs, the costs of closing the loan, giving you a better cash position up front. Now, in exchange for that, then, you would have an increase in the rate. So if you need more cash up front to get things done, you might say, okay, is it possible for me to increase the rate, accept a higher rate, and in exchange, have you give us this credit that we can apply then towards the closing costs? And that's going to be the concept here. So we could do a comparison between not having the lender credit and having the lender credit, noting that when we think about this comparison, if you're thinking about the lender credit, it's usually a situation that you're going into because you have that cash flow situation and you're willing to pay generally more over the life of the loan in order to get the cash basically up front. So now the question is, well, how is that going to play out and what's my cost benefit if I was to compare that to a situation where I didn't have the lender credit? Now, we'll do this calculations in a couple different methods. We'll start with one method here. In the next presentation, we'll take a look at another method. You want to keep in mind, of course, that the closing costs are going to be there no matter what. You're going to have the closing costs. It's just a matter of how are they going to be covered. So in the first scenario, we can think of a situation where we have the $250,000 loan. We have the closing costs, but they're going to be paid by us in the normal kind of process. And then in the second loan, we got the $250,000 loan. We have the same closing costs, but we're going to, in this scenario, have them in essence be paid by the lender in exchange for the increase in the rate. So we can basically imagine them giving us then that $9,000 from a loan standpoint in exchange for the increase in the rate. That's the first method that we will take a look at. We can also think about it, next time we'll take a look at it and think about, well, either way you have the closing costs, you could roll the closing costs basically into the effective rate, which is kind of the rate that kind of like closer to an APR type of rate, which would include the costs involved, and then look at the difference between the two methods, the two scenarios in that way as well. So I think this first method is actually a little bit easier to think about. So that's the first one we will use. So if I go to the second tab, note that we have some blank cells here that are pre-formatted that you can use to work through this practice problem. And then in the third tab, we're going to be building this basically more from scratch. Okay, so let's start. We got our information. We're going to say the home is 250. We're not going to say anything down, just to have the loan to be at the 250, just focusing in on the loan amount in essence. We've got the 30-year, and that's going to be the 360 months. We're going to say that the rate starts at 3% before anything else happens. So we don't have any points. We don't have any lender credit. We're just saying the rate is going to be at the 3%. So given that, then we could just say the bottom line rate. I'm going to put the rate down here, rate after points or percent credit. And I'm just going to have this be the same rate for our starting point of the 3%, making that a percent number group, percentifying it. We'll add 3 decimals so it'll be a little bit more precise. There's our 3%. We have our amortization table calculating based on that. That's going to be our starting point. Now remember, you still have the closing costs here, but they're going to be paid by us. They're not basically going to be rolled into the loan at this point in time. So then I'm going to copy this whole thing and do a side by side and then add the rest of the data. So I'm going to put my cursor on column A, drag on over to column I, Control C. I'm going to paste this in column K, Control V. Now we got the same data. Now to adjust my table, I got to make sure I adjust any absolute references. So this cell is an absolute reference. So I'm going to delete this one and I'm going to be pointing to that number instead. F4 on the keyboard, making it absolute. Going to then copy it down, double-clicking, copying that down. The interest rate also has an absolute reference in it. So I'm going to click on this one and change to this percent down here, the 3%. F4 on the keyboard. And then I'm going to copy that one down, just double-click on it and copy it down. To double-check this, you might want to change something like the rate to like 2% just to make sure that it refreshes. And everything, if I go on down to the bottom, should add up to 0. So that looks good. So it looks like everything's calculating properly. So let's put this back to 3%. Now I'm going to try to set up our table so that we can have it calculate whether we have points or whether we have lender credits and so on and so forth. So we had up top the effective rate, which I'm going to put right underneath the starting rate so we can see what the effective rate will be. We'll get back to calculating that shortly. We have the lender credit percent increase. So now notice that this might not be quite as standardized when you're thinking about the points versus the credits. This percent could change depending on your circumstances. So we're just going to make up the numbers on what the percent increase is going to be. I'm going to say it's going to be 0.0075. And I'm going to go to the numbers, percentify it, add a couple decimals. So we're going to have the increase of the 0.75%. So then we're going to say that the lender credit amount. Now the amount of the lender credit, again, this could vary. It could cover some of the closing costs, or it might cover all of the closing costs. You cannot typically get a lender credit over and above the closing costs, meaning you might say, well, can I increase the rate so that I get a credit that will cover part of my down payment as well? Not generally the case, right? It's generally that it has to cover the closing costs, like 3 to 5% or something of the loan price. So we're going to say here that it's going to be $9,000 for our purposes. So we're going to say that's going to be the trade-off that we had. They're going to give us a lender credit to pay off the closing costs, which we're going to say are $9,000 in exchange for an increase in the rate from 3% by 0.75% to 3.75, which of course they're going to make back in the life of the loan in the form of interest. Okay, so then we're going to say that notice we had points before, so I'm going to try to format this worksheet so that if you had points, you can do either one if you want to use this worksheet to work these problems out. And then the rate decrease per point. Now, we're not dealing with points here, but I'm just going to put this information in to try to build our worksheet 0025. And I'm going to go to the number group percent, add a couple decimals, and then we got the points fee. Points fee would be equal to the loan amount times the points that we had times 0.01. So if we had points, then just to test it out, 1 point, it would cost us $2,500, but we don't have any points. Okay, so then we have the rate down here, the rate after points or interest. So now I'm going to say the rate is going to be equal to the original rate of that 3%, and then we're going to increase it by the lender credit percent. That's going to increase it, and then it would be decreased if we had points, which would be calculated at 0.25 points times the number of points that we have, and there we have the rate. So now it's at 3.75. That's the rate what we're going to be using after we make this change. So in other words, if I had points here, if I didn't have this number and I had points, then we'd have a decrease in the rate by that 0.25. But in this case, we don't have points, and we have the this change, which was 0.0075%, taking the rate up from 3% to 3.75 in exchange for them giving us a lender credit we can then use to pay off the closing costs up front of the $9,000. So that's the idea. Now, the next thing we want to look at is the effective rate and say, well, what is that going to be in terms of the effective rate? So, and that's going to be the rate that kind of rolls everything into one number, but it's over the life of the loan. So that, and we'll calculate that again with the IRR so we can double check and see that we've done this properly. This is going to be equal to the rate brackets. We got the number of periods is 360, comma. The payment is going to be down here calculated at that 115779. And that needs to be negative as well, negative of that number, comma, the present value, this is where the little twist comes in. It's going to be the $250,000, that's the loan amount. And then we would take that amount, if we had points, we would say it would be that amount minus the points. We don't have any points right here, the cost of the points, not the percentage. And then we're going to say plus the lender credit. So the lender credit, meaning in this case, we got $250,000 plus you can basically say that we also received, in essence, $9,000 that we applied towards the closing costs. So the net inflow that we can think about what we got here was $250,000. That's going to be the loan amount that we used in order to pay for the home. So we can imagine getting the $250,000 and then paying it to the seller of the home. We also can imagine getting $9,000 and paying it back for the loan processing fees that we got, right? So that's going to be that. And so we're going to say, let's make that a percent. Let's add a couple decimals. And then I got to multiply it times 12. So we're at so the effective rate is at the 3.464%. Okay, so here's going to be our amortization table. You can see the difference in the payments that we have. So we had the 1,054 over here. Now we got the 1,157.79. That's going to be part of the cost, of course, of us picking up that $9,000 up front, which you can see will basically pay off over time. So then we can try to say, okay, well, what then, let's calculate our break-even type of analysis on this as well. Because in this scenario, we basically got money up front, which we're going to be paying for over time. So over the life of this thing, we're going to have an effective rate of the 3.46, which is higher than obviously the 3% we would have had over the life of it if we had not taken on the lender credit. But we got the money up front, which is a benefit up front. So there's a time difference in terms of when the benefit will pay off, because we got the $9,000 in essence up front. So let's calculate our break even. We can do a similar kind of break even. This is just like a cash flow estimate of the break even. And then we can get more precise on it with our IRR calculations. So we could say, all right, well, what if we had the lender credit that they gave us? I'm going to say this was equal to 9,000. So we got that extra 9,000 up front in essence. Let's go ahead and make this black and white. Home tab, font group, black and white on the colors. And then we'll say the difference in payments that are going to basically make up for this thing. So we got the payments with credit, which are going to be larger. So the payments with the credit, I'm going to round it. So it's about 1158, and the payments without, I'll just say without, are going to be equal to the 1054 about. Let's put an underline there, font group and underline. So the difference in payments then, outer column, will be equal to the 1158 minus the 1054. So about a difference of $104. So let's underline that, go into the font group and underline. And so that's going to give us our break even point between the two, which would be equal to the 9,000 divided by the difference in the payments. So it's about 87. That's going to be in months. Let's say break even point in months. Break even point in years then would be equal to the 87 divided by 12. 7, let's add some decimals. Number group, add a couple decimals. 7.23, let's make that our blue. Blue, border it. Let's make it blue. If you don't have that color right there, you can go to the more standard blue if you want that blue. And there it is. Okay, so there we have that. So now we can kind of verify that with our internal rate of return, because the same kind of thing, with the points, you could say, well, how long do I expect to be holding on to this property, and try to figure out the actual rate of return based on that, and then figure our break-even point in terms of the internal rate of return, which is a little bit more accurate. So let's see if we can make this make a little bit more sense to us. Let's recalculate the effective rate first. So we're going to say with credit. Now the item with credits are going to be the confusing point. I'm going to make this black and white. Let's go ahead and wrap it and center it. Because the item with credits, the items without credits, we're just taking that 250, so you would expect basically 3% in essence through the life of the loan. The one with the credits, the way we're calculating it here, had that difference of the $9,000, and that's why that's going to result in a different effective rate on each of the payment periods. So that's the one we want to focus in on and agree it to or tie it to the other loan, which was at a 3%. So we're trying to find the effective rate, what time frame would the effective rate or the internal rate of return equal, in essence, 3%. So we're going to say, all right, let's say this is going to be 0, 1, 2. Let's first just do the whole thing. We'll copy this down to 360. Let's just recalculate the effective rate so we get an idea of that. Going all the way down to 360 payments. 360 payments, center it, and then we're going to say this is going to be the cash flow. I'm going to put the format painter here, format paint that one. So the cash flow up top, really we're thinking of the cash flow in essence of the 250, that's the loan amount, so we can imagine getting that money and then paying it to the seller for the home, plus we got another 9,000 on the lender credit, which we can imagine them giving us the money, and then we gave it back to them to pay for their own, closing costs in essence. So we got really 259, even though that's the inflow, even though the loan amount is only at the 250,000. That's what causes kind of the problem in terms of cash flow. And then it gets made up in the increase in the payments now being about 1,158. Let's double click and bring that on down, bring it on down. And scroll on down, take a look at it. We'll see what we have down here. We'll sum this up with the total. Total equals the SUM. And then summing this up. So there we have that. And then the IRR is going to be equal to the IRR, the of this whole thing. No one calls it the but they should, even though it sounds funny. The is going to be the percent. That's the monthly IRR. If I double click on it and I multiply it times 12, we get the yearly. There's the 3.464. So that 3.464 should equal the effective rate, which should give us some verification that we're doing things properly here. So now we're going to say, okay, well, what if I did this and I looked at the rate of 87 time frames and tried to figure out the IRR at 87? Will I get to an IRR of 3%, which would mean it would be like our break-even point, you would think. Let's try that. I'm just going to copy these. I'm going to right-click and copy and put that right there. So there we got it. And then this one, I'm just going to say this equals that 259. And then I'm going to bring this down to, what do we have, 87 time frames. So 87 right there. I'm going to delete the rest of this, 87 time frames. Maybe I can even keep the total. Now I'll recalculate it. Delete, and then 87. I'm going to make that green over here. Let's make this green and say that's where they say our break even should be. Right there and right there. I think I had another green down here. I want to get rid of this green. That's not right. Ungreenify that. Okay. So at 87, we're going to say there it is. And then I gotta say, well, now we're going to pay off the loan balance here. So we got to pay that 11858, but we also have to pay off the loan balance if we were to basically sell the property at that point and pay off the loan. It would be the 212422 minus that last payment of the 1158. So we'd have a total of 213,580. So if I was to total this up, total equals the sum of these. Let's total it. That would totally be the total of the 54,150, and the IRR equals the IRR, and we'll add up the IRR calculation, close it up, times 12, and there's the calculation. Let's make it a percent, add some decimals. So we're not quite, we're looking for 3%, right? And it's not quite 3% there because, again, the ending balances are kind of different here. So this calculation up top is a good like approximation, but not, the exact amount of the numbers. So we could say, so then we can hunt around if we so choose and try to figure out, okay, well, where would it be if I wanted to get this IRR to be 3%? We could do some testing, and I've done some testing, and I'm going to go to around 66 on the time frames. So let's copy the same thing over just to show that. I'm going to copy from A to AC, put that right here. The top number is going to be the same. We're going to bring this down to 66 this time. Stop it right there. Delete, right click, delete, and then shift up. And so I'm going to say, okay, this last one, this is going to be where I'm going to stop this time, which is right here on my loan. So we'll stop it right there, make that a light green maybe. Okay, and then I'm going to say, all right, let's do the IRR there. So I need the negative. If I sold right there, I'd have to pay off the loan of that 222,448 minus the 1,158. So the total, if I was to add this up, equals the SUM, the total sum of these. So there we have it. And then the IRR would equals the IRR, brackets, taking up the range of here, closing it up times 12. Hold on a second. So there it is. If I double click, there's the formula. Making that a percent, adding a couple decimals. So that's closer to our 3% right there. So we're looking maybe more closer to that time frame of 66 time frames. So there you have it. And so you could basically say, okay, well, if I was thinking about selling this property in the short term, and I'm saying, okay, well, if they give me a lender credit of $9,000 and I sell it and I turn around and sell it, then the bank hasn't made their money back in terms of basically the increase in the payments at that point in time. So if I was to sell it earlier, then I might be better off. If I was to hold on to the property longer, of course, they're gonna make their money back because that's how, in terms of the interest, because they basically increased the rate in order to do it. So the longer that you hold on, the less likely you're going to come out to be beneficial on this. But again, remember that the idea here was, of course, to close up front, and that's why you basically pay the $9,000. So if you need the $9,000 in order to pay off the closing costs to make the cash flow work up front, so you can make the proper offer and whatnot to get things done, it's going to kind of depend a little bit on whether or not it's a buyer's market or a seller's market in terms of how much cash you're going to need at that front point and other circumstances. So given that, the question would be, well, is it worth the cost in order to get this done? You could do this kind of comparison for that. Okay, but if you're doing something where you're holding on to it for a shorter period of time and you're doing that kind of deal, then the break-even point, you might decide how long you're going to be holding it and see whether or not it'd be worthwhile to do the lender credit under those circumstances. Okay, so let's go ahead and bluify this. We're going to select these items. Going to make the brackets. I'm going to put the blue around it. Let's do that here and here. Blue and border. The blue and border. Border blue. Border blue. Border and blue. Let's do that. And then we're going to put some underline. Let's put an underline here. Let's put an underline there. And let's put an underline all the way down at the bottom right there. And so there we go. I'm going to scroll back up, and there is that.